So it's over to you, Oleg. So Belyaev will talk about ergative gender agreement in Dargwa.
Thank you for the introduction. Well, this time, even though there is control in the heading, I will actually try to argue that there is no control involved here as such. Dargwa languages. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's probably better.
Give me a second.
Okay.
Does it already?
It seems to. Okay. So, Dargwa languages are a group of East Caucasian languages spoken in central Dagestan. So here you have on the map by Yuri Korykov the distribution of Dargwa varieties. Traditionally, they are viewed as dialects of a single language called Dargwa, but this is due to Soviet language policy as usual, which lumped different languages together. But in terms of any kinds of evidence, both lexical and grammatical, this is a family of closely related languages. And here you have the main groups of dialects shown on the map. They are characterized as all East Caucasian languages by SOV, word order, and ergative alignment, at least as far as case marking is concerned, and by a relatively complex verb morphology and a very elaborate system of nominal cases, mostly spatial cases. And that's all usual for Dagestani languages. What is unusual about Dargwa is that in addition to gender agreement, which is once again a very salient trait of the majority of East Caucasian languages, Dargwa also has person agreement, something which is typical only for a small number of languages of this family, and which is an independent innovation in this group. And person agreement is hierarchical, so it's based not on subject-object agreement, but on the person hierarchy, and that's what. This final point, personal-gender agreement, is what we will focus on this presentation. So, gender agreement in Dargwa is organized as in most Dagestani languages. So here you have a system of 3 genders, all very semantically transparent, uniformed across different agreement targets. So you have 3 genders in the singular, distinguished masculine, feminine, masculine, human, and feminine, human, and neuter. Neuter means non-human. And in the plural, you distinguish only between humans and non-humans. So you have the same set of markers in all dialects, minus phonetic differences, and they all get the same form regardless of whether they appear in prefix position, suffix position, on verbs, on adverbs, on adjectives, and so on. And gender agreement in Dargwa occurs regularly in the following context. So first, it's a prefix on the majority of verb stems. Second, it's a suffix on attributive forms, in which case it agrees with the head noun. And finally, it's a suffix on essive nouns and adverbs. So all adverbs which mean location without movement take the gender agreement suffix. And at clause level, that is in the case of verb stems and nouns and essive nouns and adverbs, locative nouns and adverbs, the control is always, almost always, as we will see in a short while, the absolutive argument of the clause. So on the verb, it is always the case that you agree with the whatever is absolute, that is the object of the transitive verb and the sole argument of an intransitive verb. So here, for example, you have the subject is Fatimat, which is a feminine name corresponding to Arabic Fatima. So here you have a feminine prefix agreeing with Fatima, and in this case you have Murat has caught Fatimat in the forest. Sorry for stupid examples, but the verb to catch is a very good verb to check because it's a normal transitive verb without any strange markings. That's why I use the catch. So here the verb to catch has the agreement prefix in the feminine, which corresponds to this direct object, to Patimat, because the subject is masculine, Murat, and the noun in the forest also has this suffix here, which is also feminine. So the adverb in the forest, the adverbial noun phrase in the forest, agrees also with the absolutive argument of the clause. Now going to person agreement in Dargwa is expressed by a number of different markers. So here on the top we will only look at mostly at examples which concern the clitic set and the preterite set. So the clitic set is a set of n-clitic person markers which attach to various non-finite forms to form periphrastic verbal paradigms, tense and aspect paradigms. You see here a typical configuration of person for this family, where you have the first person and the second person plural expressed by one thing, and the second person singular has a special marker. And the third person has the copial, which is in parentheses, because it is not used in all verb forms. And there's also the preterite set shown here below, where you have a more straightforward, familiar inflection paradigm. But also in the third person you have no number distinction. Now the rules of agreement resolution, of person agreement resolution, are decidedly different from the rules of gender agreement, and in fact, as I mentioned, they're hierarchical. So in transitive clauses, person agreement is with S, of course, not with P. So in transitive clauses, the the personal agreement is with the absolute argument, that is with the sole argument of the intransitive clause, should be S, of course. And intransitive clauses, there is variation among dialects, but in H2, which I will be mostly concerned with here, and in fact in TAN2, which is the other dialect which we will be looking at here, agreement is determined by the following hierarchy of persons. So speech act participants outrank third person, non-speech act participants. And if both arguments are speech act participants, then it is the absolutive argument which sort of wins. So here you see that if in the sentence I quote Murat, where the subject is first person and the patient is third person, the agreement is controlled by the subject because it's first person. In the second example, the object is first person, and again the agreement suffix on the verb is first person because this object outranks the subject. Whereas in a situation where you have the first person agent and the second person agent, the agreement is in the second person here because it is the patient which wins in such a situation. And finally, if you have, conversely, if you have a second person subject and the first person patient, you have first person agreement because it is the patient which wins, not any kind of, not either first or second person, they have the same rank in the system. And you only get third person agreements when both arguments are third person, like in this last example. So the frame around the argument signifies that it is the agreement controller, the person agreement controller in this case. Right, so that's how the main system works. That's more or less fine, but this clear picture, this clear separation between gender agreement agreeing always with the absolutive and personal agreement being hierarchical runs into problems if we look at how the copula, the third person agreement marker, which has a gender agreement slot, behaves. So Nina Sumbatova has shown for TAN2 Dargwa a different variety, but in this particular case it is similar to H2, that the copula can agree alternatively in gender with the absolutive or the ergative. So you see here that Murat is building a house in TAN2, so in TAN2 has the neutral agreement, and this cannot be different here, so it is as we expect with the absolutive, but the copula, the third person marker, can have the general agreement slot which is incorporated into the third person marker, can agree not only with the absolutive as we would expect, but also with the ergative. So if we try to describe agreements in Dargwa in terms of feature types and their agreement rules, this is clearly a problem because we want to say that, well, we kind of traditionally we say that personal agreement is hierarchical and gender agreement is with the absolutive. But here we clearly have a case where gender agreement is with the ergative in this first example, right? So you see the prefixes in the neutral as we expect, but the suffix, the clitic marker, is in the masculine. So how can we handle this situation? How can we account for this? Clearly, it is not a person hierarchy because both are third person. So we cannot say that somehow, or can we, but okay, so here we clearly have some competition between third person arguments for gender agreement control. And the factor which determines the control is topicality, at least according to Nina's description, and shortly I will show that in H2 it does seem to be the case. Also see the recent grammar of TAN2, unfortunately in Russian, but those of you who read Russian can read about it in more detail on that grammar. And notably in TAN2, both agent and patient gender agreement are available even if one of the arguments is a first or second person participant. Although, as Nina writes in this book, P agreement requires a certain kind of emphasis. So in a sentence like "you are keeping the girl at home," typically you agree with the second person. So if you have a gender agreement slot both in the copula and the personal agreement slot, they both agree with the second person argument. But you can have a mismatch. So you can have the personal agreement slot agree with the second person, with the subject, but the gender agreement can be with the direct object. When I sort of emphasize, so I keep the girl at home alone. That's what Nina writes, right? So I'm not sure what exactly this emphasis stands for, but it seems to be possible in principle to have a mismatch between personal agreement and gender agreement on the auxiliary in TAN2. Unfortunately, there is no data on what happens when both arguments are SAP, so when an SAP is in the direct object position, which, as we will see, will be crucial for our analysis of H2 data. And what is the solution that Nina proposes? And she proposes a rather elaborate analysis which involves dividing the clause into two layers, roughly corresponding to the IP layer and VP layer. So the upper layer is headed by the auxiliary, here, and the lower layer contains the lexical verb in a non-finite form and the main arguments of the clause. And her idea is that there is a zero absolutive in the upper layer which is coreferential with either the subject or the object of the lower clause. And so it is this absolutive which the auxiliary agrees with. So the auxiliary has, in fact, absolute gender agreement. Even if it seems to us that it agrees with the ergative, it is in fact not true. It agrees with the absolutive. Simply this absolutive is 0, and it's identified with either of the core participants of the lower clause. So that's the way she explains the situation. And in this way, she can have the same agreement rule for all gender agreement. And an additional confirmation of this idea is that clause peripheral adverbs. So when an adverb stands at the left or right periphery of the clause, but only in that position, it can optionally agree with the ergative as well, like in this example. So at Muhammad's place, Rasul is eating meat. So Rasul is the subject, meat is the object, and at Muhammad's place can agree either with the noun meat, as would be typical for adverbs in this language, or with the subject, or with Rasul. But only in a situation when this adverb is located at the left or right periphery. And so according to Nina, this means that this adverb is attached not in the lower layer, but in the upper stratum of the clause, and therefore they agree with that absolutive which is at the upper stratum of the clause, and not with the lower absolutive, in this case meat. And that's why you have masculine agreement here. And that's why you have this restriction on their position. And in general, the analysis, even though it does decidedly look a little bit far-fetched, and there are various problems with implementing it if we try to implement it in LFG, which, well, one may try to do, but generally it seems to be justified for Tanti based on available data. And unfortunately it seems that, well, I don't have access to Tanti data, but I have tried to look at this in HT, and it seems that in HT, which generally has the same system of agreement, it is not required to postulate such a complex system, and we can in fact analyze this without resorting to such complex mechanisms. And I suspect that in Tanti, the same analysis which I'm going to propose now can work. So let's look at the data of HT. HT does not use a copula in the third person in non-negative contexts. That's a little bit problematic because this means that in the majority of cases we cannot really tell what gender the verb agrees with. But fortunately, there are some paradigms, like the existential-based paradigms, where you have this verb to be, which always have an agreement slot. So you have in the third person, in the first person, you have both the gender agreement slot and the person agreement marker, right? Murat is going, here you have masculine gender agreements, and a 0 marker for the third person, and in the first person you have a first person marker and also a gender agreement marker. So I will mostly use these forms for HT. So for Tanti and for other dialects, it's mostly the case that they behave in the same way as ordinary periphrastic forms, so I don't see a problem here. And the important advantage in this case is that there is a gender marker in each person. So you can actually see both gender and person reflected on the auxiliary, and this will be very important for what we're going to see now. And now, just like in Tanti, in HT the auxiliary can agree in gender with the ergative, with A, in the third person. So here Rasul is catching Patimat, Patimat is feminine, Rasul is masculine, and we can alternatively agree with either feminine, shown here by underline, or with masculine as shown by the box. And again, as in Tanti, this seems to correlate with topicality. So more research is needed, but some examples here are illustrative. So these are examples, unfortunately, not from HT, because in HT, as I said, it's difficult to find good examples in the text, because there are very few forms which have a gender agreement slot in the auxiliary. But Kubachi is very closely related, and in Kubachi they do have the third person copula. So I will show you some Kubachi examples which to illustrate that this typicality thing. So this is a collection of stories about Mullah Nasruddin, a very popular Islamic character, well, probably pan-Islamic character of anecdotes. So here we have a very clear situation. So here is the beginning of a text, and they say, when he reached Mamet Kalai at the station, he gave his back to a porter. And the verb to give agrees in the masculine. So the auxiliary agrees in the masculine, because it's a text about Mullah, and in the beginning he came, and so it's clear that he's the topic. But in the second example, we already are concerned with the back, with the fate of the back, and here the verb agrees in the neuter plural with the back. So the back is neuter plural for some reason, whatever. That's maybe a lexical thing in this dialect. So you have the prefixal agreements with neuter plural, and the copula also agrees not with the subject, not with those guys who gave the back to the mullah, but with the back. So it's not a passive, clearly. So if you think it's a passive, no, there's no passive in these languages. So this is an issue of agreement, not an issue of syntax, of syntactic case marking. And the second example, so this is a story about the mullah who was accused of something in court, and then he brought a hen to the judge the day before, and in the morning the judge just acquitted him without even asking for his opinion. And he was asked, why has the judge acquitted you without you saying anything? And he said, at night the hen has already said everything for me. So the hen, because he gave the bribe, and so the hen sort of explained everything. So here the verb agrees with this everything and not with the hand, because obviously the topic is why is the situation when he hasn't said anything and that he has been acquitted, not the hand, which is the topic here. And a similar example here, so mullah, a different example but also illustrative. So the mullah came to the minbar and said, how powerful Allah is that He's created the world in 6 months. And then someone approaches him and says, what are you saying? God created the world not in 6 months but in 6 days. And here the verb agrees with the world, because we're discussing the creation of the world. And in the second example, the mullah replies, I do also know that it is said that He has created the world in 6 days, but would you believe me if I had said that? Some sort of a typical Caucasian, somewhat different to translate Caucasian humor here involved here. But the important point here is that here he's retelling a neutral information structure neutral statement about how the God created the world, and here we have masculine agreement, because he's again speaking about God, how He created the world, not about the world itself as such. Okay, so that's some examples of typicality. There are many more, so it seems to me quite clear from the Kubachi text that it's topic and not something else. So far so good. So far everything seems to behave just according to the zero absolutive hypothesis, to what we see in Tanti. But when one of the arguments is first or second persons, and the other is third person, it turns out that gender agreement can only be with the speech as participant argument. That is, the gender agreement has to reflect the features of the same argument as person agreement reflects. So I'm catching Patimat can only have masculine and first person. So it has to agree with the first person argument in both gender and person. And if the first person argument is the direct object, then it has to agree with this argument, again in masculine, first person masculine singular, and not with the feminine one. It cannot agree with the feminine argument. And that's strange, right? Why would you have this correlation if you have just a zero absolutive, which is independent from person agreement? Well, you could say probably here that typically the first person and second person argument is a topic, therefore this is merely an elicitation failure, that the speakers analyze this as being the topic, and that's why you get first person agreement. Okay. But when both arguments are SAPs, again, gender agreement can only be with the absolutive argument. So again, this directly mirrors person agreement. And this is difficult to explain if we assume the topicality hypothesis, right? So in the first case, I'm catching you. Here you can only agree in the second person feminine. So if you are feminine, as reflected on the verbal prefix, the verb can also only agree with the feminine second person feminine and not with first person masculine. And similarly, you are catching me. Again, you can only agree in the first person and in masculine. So you have to agree exactly with the same argument that controls gender agreement. And this does not at all agree, I think, with the idea of a zero absolutive, because why would it correlate with person agreement? Why would there be such a correlation if, as Nina assumes, you have a separate mechanism for gender agreement and the zero absolutive, and a separate mechanism for person agreement? And here they seem to be clearly related. And so therefore, I think that in this case we have to strive for a solution which assumes that both of them eventually go to the same agreement mechanism and reflect the same features of the same controller. But still, the one problem remains, this adverb agreement thing, right? So, okay, so we can maybe provide a different solution for the auxiliaries, but why do adverbs also agree in the ergative in this case? So, Ashti does allow, just like Tanti, this ergative adverb agreement. So here, Rasul is catching Patimat in the forest, the verb to be, the auxiliary agrees in masculine with the ergative, and also the adverb on the periphery can agree with the ergative, just like we saw a couple of slides before in Tanti. But it seems actually that this phenomenon is completely independent from the phenomenon of auxiliary agreement, because at least in Ashti, the adverb may agree with the ergative argument even when the auxiliary agrees with the patient. Right, so if the auxiliary here, the same sentence, but the auxiliary agrees with the patient. If the auxiliary agrees with the patient, then according to Nina's analysis, it means that the zero absolutive in the main clause, in the upper clause, is also agreeing with the patient. That is, it should be feminine in this sentence. In this case, why can you have ergative agreement? So there's nowhere this masculine feature could come from, because if the auxiliary is with the feminine, this analysis predicts the only grammatical configuration would be agreeing with the absolutive, that is with the feminine as well, but not with the masculine. So this example should be ungrammatical in this zero absolutive analysis, right? Because this year here implies that there should only be year on the adverb, and yet you can have this masculine adverb agreement, which seems to mean that this is a topic which is also interesting. We don't know why this happens. But this is completely independent in any case from what we are discussing here, from agreement of the auxiliary. And I think a better explanation, which is just an educated guess at this point, but it seems that a better explanation is that such adverbs are in fact secondary predicates, like while being in the forest, which have their own subject, which this essive marker agrees with. And in fact, this is confirmed by the fact that my informants prefer to add, when the adverb agrees in the ergative, they prefer to add the conjunction, the subordinating conjunction mu-til, which means when. So when in the forest, Murat kot Patimat. And this, to me, is indicative of the fact that this is in fact a secondary predication. And this analysis would also explain these rather weird examples that Nina also produces in support of this hypothesis. So that's a little bit complicated. So at the lesson, either Musa reads newspapers or Patimat draws devils. So drawing devils is an expression for drawing some stupid things in the textbook. So here you have two coordinate clauses, each of which has a masculine or feminine singular subject and neuter plural object. And yet the copula and the adverb agree in the human plural. So how can you explain that? How can you have such agreement? So Mina's solution is that the zero absolutive and the main layer has split antecedents. So it has that both ergatives have a split antecedents, and that's why you can agree in the human plural in the main clause. But I think that for Ashti, well, I couldn't list such examples for Ashti because they are very elaborate, but I guess they could be possible. And the thing is that her explanation that this is the split antecedents, but an equally plausible explanation for the adverb agreement pattern is that it's basically just a small clause, and therefore in the small clause you have its own subject which can have split antecedents just like converb subjects generally can, because it's an aphoric control basically. So that's my proposal for this situation. Now, so to generalize the descriptive part of the talk, there seems to be no positive evidence in favor of the backwards control hypothesis in HT, and in fact rather the controller of gender agreement on the auxiliary is identical to the controller of person agreement. In fact, a similar line of reasoning can be found in old grammars, so old grammars have the same intuition, but of course expressed in rather archaic terms, but more or less in the same pattern. So if you extrapolate this to the third person, it means that there is also competition between third person controllers. Just like there is competition between SAPs, there is also competition between third person controllers. So if a speech check participant competes with a non-speech check participant, then it is always the speech check participant that wins. If two SAPs compete with each other, then it is the patient which wins. And finally, if two non-speech check participants compete, when two third person arguments compete, that it is the topic which wins. So in the third person, it is topicality which becomes an issue, whereas in the first and second person, it is grammatical relations. And this can be expressed differently by just modifying the person hierarchy and splitting the third person into two sub-persons, a third person topic and just a normal third person. And grammatical relations hierarchy stays the same. The agreement rule stays the same. And in fact, what we see here is a typical proximate obviative system. So typologically, this is quite typical to split the third person into a proximate sort of topical thing and an obviative thing, and then agree have this split in the third person, but not in the other persons. This is in fact, this person hierarchy is equivalent to what we have, for example, in Plains Korea, as described in ISO 1997, where you also have first and second persons versus third person's topics versus other third persons in the agreement system. So it's exactly the same, and typologically this is much better than postulating backwards control in every finite predication, I think. Well, now to proceed to the analysis, I will start with the following problem. Well, it's not really a problem as much as a problem for... Do you have enough time left?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So it's not much of a problem for the theory as a problem for the traditional approach to agreement in this language. So traditionally we say that you have person agreements, you have person and number, and it reflects. It's based on these rules, and you have gender agreement, it's based on that rules, and you want to keep them separate. But the problem is that, and then there's a problem of course, because in this case you would have to say that person agreement also agrees, a person agreement mark agrees in gender. So that sounds contradictory. But the thing is that person and gender agreements in these languages are misleading anyway, because actually gender agreement can involve person features, as shown for example by Corbett for Archie. And the same argument that Corbett used for Archie works for Ashti and other Dargwa varieties as well. So in these languages the neuter plural marker the is also used for first and second person plural arguments. So Rasul saw me, here is first person singular, and you agree in the feminine, well, if I am feminine. I chose feminine because masculine would not be visible in this particular instance. Rasul saw us instead will have not human plural, as we would expect semantically, but neuter plural. This the and not b which is human plural. And again, the traditional way to analyze this is to say that basically the word nusa, the word us, has a special fourth gender. It's a special gender for words like we, which agrees in, which has the marker the. The problem is that this marker also comes up if we coordinate two singular nouns, which resolve to first person plural. Right? So Rasul, so me and Murat, we have the here, even though there is no word us, there is no lexical carrier of this class feature, of this gender. So this means that genuinely person markers, so gender markers reflect person features in this language. And therefore, I don't think there is a huge problem with saying that person markers affect gender features in the same way. And the solution, I think, is to move away from a view of agreement tied to feature types in Dargwa. So the standard description is that gender agreement is with the absolutive, person agreement is hierarchical, and I think what stands behind all these attempts to model them in different ways is that when we see gender agreement with the ergative, we try to show that there is in fact an absolutive there somewhere with which it agrees. And conversely, when we see gender markers reflecting person features, we try to say that there's a special gender for certain pronouns which explains this situation. And rather, I think in this case, agreement involves all features which are shared as bundles, and then there's only a target and the controller, and which of the features are actually reflected on the target is a morphological issue. So for example, normally the third person marker has a gender slot, but first and second persons do not have a gender slot, therefore we don't find gender in those persons, but existential verbs have it in all persons, so we find gender expressed everywhere. And conversely, singular gender markers are unmarked for person, while plural markers are marked for first and second versus third person. And if we keep Nina Sumbatova's analysis that each clause has two tiers, two domains and two targets, we can have separate rules for each kind of agreement. And for modeling this in LFG, I will use Doug Howe and Tanya Nikitina's proposal to use feature sharing. So this is an example, I think, from their paper, taken from Akim and Niemann. So here we have feature sharing is a situation where basically a clause that agrees with an argument has its own agreement features, which are shared with the agreement features of one of the arguments, in this case the subject. So how unfortunately women are, the verb is in first person plural, and this is because the verb has its own agreement features which are shared with the first person plural features of the subject. I think that's also how it's done in HPSG, if I'm not mistaken, right? So that's part should be familiar. And in Dargwa we can handle agreement in a similar way, so we have two clause layers, one of them is headed by the auxiliary, one of them is headed by the lexical verb, and both have agreement features, and the agreement features of the lower tier are with the absolute, so piv, I use here Yehuda Fark's terminology, so pivot is in ergative language identified with the object in the transitive clause, so here the agreement feature bundle of the lower stratum agrees with the pivot, is shared with the pivot's features, and of the upper stratum it's shared, in this case, with the subject, so it's based on the hierarchical alignment. And in this way, we have all the features shared, and then the question is just simply which of them the morphology decides to reflect or not. But we have all features shared between them, and then the morphemes, the gender markers, the person markers just reflect the other features of their domain. So if they appear here, they reflect the gender features of this domain. If they appear here, they reflect the gender and person features of this domain. But actually there's nothing that would force us to use agreement sharing for both person and gender agreement, right? So we could theoretically say that since gender is always with the absolute, if there is no competition, no hierarchy, we can do it the old-fashioned way through feature code specification, and then keep agreements or this agreement sharing only for the person hierarchical type. And this would allow us to do away with the two tiers of clause structure, so which might be unoptimal according to some of you probably. However, there does seem to be independent evidence in favor of a two-tier analysis, apart from agreement. So first of all, the fact that adverbs can only agree in ergative when they appear at clause edges means that the clause edge position is somehow different from the adjunction in the lower stratum. Secondly, only clause edge converbs can be different subject. So, for example, Ali gave money and Rasul entered the university. You have an ergative subject of the converb, Ali, and Rasul is the absolutive subject of the main clause. Sorry for the example, unfortunately this is the reality in most Dagestani universities nowadays. You can only go if you give money, not officially of course. So here you have you see that each clause has its own subject, but you cannot embed such a clause which has its own subject, which is not same subject. But you can do it in the same subject context, like here, Rasul in the absolutive, so it means it's in the main clause. Having given money, went to the university. Here you can have embedding because it's the same subject, and it doesn't in fact matter where the subject is expressed. So you can have backwards control as well. To the university, Rasul having given money, okay, so here to the university is in a locative case, which means that it's an argument of the verb to come and not of the verb to give, in case you're wondering. So here it's clear that it's embedding. So again, you will have a position inside the clause, which is different in the syntactic features from the properties from the position on the clause periphery, which also suggests that there are two tiers. Finally, we have the second level periphrastic forms, which the auxiliary has its own time features. And, well, I will skip this. The second is more easy. So we can have negation either in some periphrastic forms, we can have negation either on the lexical verb or on the auxiliary, which I think also can suggest that you have to have different positions for negation features. Okay, so this can be achieved by using the following lexical entries in LFG for the verb and auxiliary. So you have IP, which splits into the auxiliary, and the S layer, the lower clause, which is the complement of this auxiliary, and then the S layer is basically non-configurational, so we have the verb and whatever precedes it, any number of NPs, which form till some grammatical functions. Then a verb, like a lexical verb like this, to do, agrees, has its agreement features shared with the agreement features of the absolutive, and has this neuter singular constraining equation. And an auxiliary, so here it also has this first person masculine singular, so since this auxiliary has both person and gender features, it has these constraining equations. And the second equation shows that its agreement can be shared with either the subject or the object of the complement. So what decides here which of them gets to be the controller? And here I use my earlier approach from the 2013 LG proceedings, where I use a set of OT constraints to model the competition between agreement controllers. But in this case we have to modify it and simplify it, because since here in that approach is, some of you maybe remember that I relegated the agreement controller to M structure, because I didn't have a position in the F structure which would be filled by the controller of person agreement. But since here we model it using other features on the clause level, thank you. So since here on the clause level we have the agreement features, we can actually do without M structure. We can simply say that there is competition between who gets to share its features with the agreement position. So we don't actually need a separate level of representation. And the following constraints, so there is a constraint which says the agreement controller should be second person, should be first person, should be a third person topic, should be a subject, should be an object. So here we have this functional uncertainty. So first we go to the agreement slot of the upper stratum, then we go back using inside out uncertainty back, and then we get into the lower clause because it's shared, and then we check whether it's a GF or a pivot, well, or an A or a P. That's the motivation. We have these 5 constraints. And the language-specific ranking for HT is this. So, speech act participant, topic, pivot, and subject. So the reason why I have 2 different constraints for first and second persons here is that other dialects have second person domination. So I have to distinguish between them cross-linguistically. Even though for HT, we just have speech act participant versus third person. So some sample tableau. So for example, here I have called Petimat. I is first person, Petimat is third person. That's why Petimat fails to control agreement simply because you prefer a speech act participant. If I quote you, then in fact both do not violate this constraint, and then both violate the topic, third person topic constraint, because both are first and second persons, but the patient wins because the agent violates this absolutive constraint. And finally, when 2 third person arguments compete and one of them is the topic, then we have this constraint, which so both of them violate the first and second person constraint, but the topic wins because it's a topic, well, a third person topic. So that's how we describe this system. Yeah, the shading should be different, they should be white. Okay, so to conclude, actually data do not support the backwards control hypothesis, at least, well, according to what we know at this time. So maybe other dialects have other systems. I don't want, so unfortunately I can't access Tang-T, or I can't access other varieties which have similar system, but at least for HT I think this is superfluous to say that there is a zero absolutive or something like this, some kind of backwards control in the finite clause. Gender agreement on the auxiliary merely reflects the gender feature of the person agreement control. And the third person is split based on typicality, so first or second person, if they compete in a single sentence, their choice is determined by syntax, the absolutive, or P wins, whereas third person versus third person is determined by typicality, and this is quite typical, so as an approximate obviative system, which is generally in these systems notated in this way, so 3 prime is the obviative, so we can say that we have approximate and obviative, and this puts Dargwa, puts HT in the wider context of such hierarchical systems, and in fact, there are many things in which Dargwa is reminiscent of Algonquian languages. You also have second-person domination in many cases. You also have inverse alignment in some verb forms. You also have final obviation. So this is typologically quite well motivated, I think. So better than alternatives. And if we keep this the clause structure multi-tiered, agreement patterns can simply be identified with clausal tiers rather than features which they agree in, so person or gender. And the OT approach, which I proposed earlier, can be modified and account for the relevant data. Even if you don't like OT, well, at least in this case it handles the competition rather nicely. And, well, I don't know of any good alternatives in this case. So that's some literature, and thank you very much.
So I really like your talk and that you're trying to simplify things. But there's one thing I didn't understand. I didn't understand the two-tier approach to clausal, because all the constraints you're giving, they seem to apply to just one thing.
To the upper straight, yeah. You mean the OT constraint?
Yeah. So I get all this. I mean, I get all this. But if you go back to slide 16, was it?
This one maybe, or which one?
Yeah, maybe this one.
Where you have the two tiers.
Yeah, so do you apply the constraints separately? Do you apply them twice?
Well, you only apply it to this. Okay, so you have to. You have to stipulate that you apply. Oh, sorry, yeah. You have to stipulate that you apply them only here at this tier, because you don't. It doesn't make sense to apply them at this tier because there is nothing that algorithms share. So I mean, this constraints only applies to this upper tier agreement with the hierarchical one. So you have to say that these constraints only apply to this algorithm.
Okay, so
you check whether whatever it is shared with here is a GF or a PIV.
Right. So that's the one that the upper one is what your talk has been about.
Yeah.
But then why do you?
The lower one is just absolutive always. It's not.
So then why do you need that kind of sharing too? And I'll tell you what's bugging me, because I've been trying to advocate that you don't have this kind of comp analysis for auxiliary structures. I'd like to have just the auxiliary be a bunch of features. I mean, there might be a reason why it is a comp structure or an X-comp structure, but
yeah, so I tried.
I'm not sure that there needs to be one, so I was puzzled about the two-tier analysis here.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's possible to do this particular thing, which I'm doing here with a single-tier analysis, because, as I say here, that we don't actually have to use agreement sharing for both positions. So, I mean, the problem here is that if we want to use agreement sharing for everything, then we need two agro features. We need two tiers, because we need to have two different configurations of sharing. But then you don't really have to model this absolutive agreement by feature sharing, because it's always absolute. Yeah, exactly. So we can do it the old-fashioned style. And I think, at least I asked Doug, and at least according to what I understand, the intention of their paper was not to say that all agreements should be handled using feature sharing. So we can do it actually with just one tier and with no sharing in this case. So with no feature sharing for absolutive.
And then catch could just be the main verb, and auxiliary could just be, or the B could just be an auxiliary, rather than this being like a predicative construction. Yeah,
true, it could be. But then I have some arguments that say that there is some distinction between these two tiers, right? So you can only have ergative agreement on the periphery, you can only have same subject embedded and different subjects.
These are different constructions again, because there's at least two verbs in there.
Yeah.
Like two real verbs. I mean, this.
But I mean, you could say that they attach at different levels, and that's why you have two different adjunct sets at the lower level and the upper level, something like this. But yes, you could alternatively say that it's a C structure thing, and then a C structure, one of them is let's say an X edge, and the other is an edge. So it's not completely conclusive, but I mean, this is just a bunch of things. Because I like this picture when you have two agreement sharing configurations. And I also like the idea that you automatically get all features shared, so you don't have to say this is person, this is gender. You sort of just the morphology is a separate issue which reflects.
But you can do that via template type stuff.
Yeah, well, true. You can do it by
that's not an issue.
For this you do need sharing because you have competition, right?
Yeah.
So it's difficult to handle without sharing. But for this you don't actually need it. Yeah, I agree.
People are hungry. No? Thank you. Thanks for being here.